working. So you just have to look at the screen on my right. Okay, so I'm Dr. Mark Gataras, and I've been tasked by Dr. Michael Codelmar to give you a series of lectures on the neuroanatomy. So this will be five topics or five chapters from our textbook. So today we'll just take up three of the five chapters. I understand our time is 8 to 12. 8 to 12. So we won't use up the whole time. But we'll be taking up three topics today. So the first one will be generalities of the nervous system. Okay, so we have two functional divisions of our nervous system. We have the central and then the peripheral nervous system. When we say central nervous system, we mean the brain and the spinal cord. So they are the components making up the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is anything that is part of the nervous system outside the brain and spinal cord. So the peripheral nerves, the peripheral ganglia, they are part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so here we have a side view showing the brain inside the cranium. Okay, so that's the brain, and then connected to the brain is the spinal cord. Okay, so again, that's the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. And then coming out from the spinal cord, we have these nerve roots. So the thoracic nerve roots are colored red, cervical nerve roots are colored blue. So lumbar, sacral, occipital nerve roots, and we also have cranial nerves coming out from the brain. So these nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay? And then this is a front view. So again, showing the spinal cord and the brain, that's the central nervous system, and then the different peripheral nerves. So spinal nerves and cranial nerves going up. So those are parts of the peripheral nervous system. To understand the function of the nervous system, we have to go down into the basic functional unit of the nervous system. And the basic functional unit is the nerve cell. Another name for nerve cell is neuron. So the neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system. So it is composed of a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. So the nerve cell or neuron has a cell body which contains the nucleus and the different cytoplasmic organelles, and then it has dendrites and an axon. The axon is a process of the nerve cell that transmits impulses to another neuron. So the function of the neuron is to transmit impulses. So it does this using its axon. So the impulse, the nerve signal, can go to another neuron, or it can go to a target organ, or a muscle. So if it is a motor neuron, it can send its signal to a muscle and tell that muscle to contract. And when the muscle contracts, it will shorten and pull along with it the bones. No? So we have movement. If the nerve cell's axon goes to a gland, no? For example, it goes to the sweat gland, it can tell the sweat gland to produce sweat. No? And then that will cause sweat on the skin, which when it evaporates, it will cool the body. So it can cool down your body. So, and it can also send its signal to another neuron, either strengthen or modify that signal. Okay, and it uses the axon to do this. In the case of sensory nerves, the axon will transmit impulses to the central nervous system from peripheral sensory organs. Also, for example, we have touch receptors on our skin. The touch impulse signal is sent up to the spinal cord and up to the brain using the axon. Okay, so this is how a typical motor neuron appears. So this is the cell body. The cell body is usually found in the brain, and there is a nucleus. And then on the cell body, we have these processes called the dendrites. The dendrites receive signals from other neurons. And then the neuron sends its own signal outward using this process. This is the axon, and it can be a long process. For example, the motor neurons in our frontal lobe can send their axons down into the spinal cord. So that's a long distance away. So the axon can be very long. And the axon can span from the brain down to the peripheral nervous system. So it can be a very long process. Okay? So that's a typical motor neuron. What about sensory neurons that send the signals back to the brain? So the sensory neurons also have a cell body with a nucleus, but their axons appear like this. So the axon will receive sensory signals from the periphery, and it sends the signal upwards to the central nervous system, to the brain. So this is a typical appearance of a sensory neuron. Okay? And here, we can also see how the cell bodies are related to the axons. So again, for motor neurons, for example, this motor neuron in the spinal cord, the cell body is in the anterior word of the spinal cord. It sends its axon outward, becomes part of the peripheral nervous system, and then it innervates skeletal muscle. So when it sends a signal to the muscle will shorten. Okay? So that's a motor neuron. For a sensory neuron, the cell body is usually found in a posterior root ganglion. It's a ganglion outside the spinal cord. The cell body is here, and the signal travels from the periphery, from a touch receptor on your fingertip. For example, the signal goes towards the central nervous system. It goes to the spinal cord. Okay? So that's a motor neuron, that's a sensory neuron. And then we also have autonomic neurons, which are two neuron pathways. So there is a presynaptic neuron in the spinal cord, which sends its signal to the cell body of the postsynaptic neuron here. The postsynaptic neuron cell body is in a peripheral autonomic ganglion. autonomic ganglion will send the signal to the different visceral organs. So it can send signals to the glands, to the heart, to the smooth muscle in the gastrointestinal tract to produce contraction, to produce increased heart rate, increased contractility of the heart, to cause the glands to secrete. So that's the autonomic neurons. So in contrast to the motor and sensory, which are just single neurons, the pathway for the autonomic nervous system is there are two neurons. So there's a presynaptic neuron on this neuron. That's presynaptic, and then this is the postsynaptic neuron. The synapse or the junction between the two neurons is in a peripheral autonomic ganglion. So aside from neurons or nerve cells, we also have supporting cells in our nervous system. And these supporting cells are collectively called the neuroglial, the neuroglial cells. They are the supporting cells. They do not send signals, but they support the neurons. And examples of neuroglia are Schwann cells, oligodendrocytes, and microglia. So Schwann cells produce an insulation. So here we can see the nucleus of a Schwann cell and its cell membrane. The Schwann cell wraps around an axon. So it serves like the insulator for the axon. So it will help the nerve signal travel faster and more efficiently. So this Schwann cell acts to support this neuron. So it's a supporting cell. So that's the Schwann cell. Schwann cells are found in the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, in the brain and the spinal cord, their role is taken up by oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are also supporting cells, and they produce the insulation in the central nervous system. And then the other type of supporting cell is the microglia. These are actually part of our immune system. They are phagocytosing cells. They can eat up any bacteria or virus that gets into the nervous system. So they are part of the immune system. The neuronal connections. So if the collection of the nerve cell bodies is found within the central nervous system, so within the brain and spinal cord, the collection of nerve cell bodies is termed a nucleus. So nucleus if it's inside the central nervous system, but if the collection is found in the peripheral nervous system, it is called a ganglion. So ganglion. If the bundle of nerve fibers are those that connect nuclei in the central nervous system, it's called a tract, a nerve tract. But if it's in the peripheral nervous system, the bundle of nerve fibers is called a nerve. And the nerve will include the bundle of nerve fibers, the connective tissue holding it together, and blood vessels serving it in the peripheral nervous system. So this is a cross-section of a typical nerve. It is composed of multiple axons. So this is one axon of a neuron with its insulation on the Schwann cell. There are many axons that are bundled together, and these axons that are bundled together are called nerve fascicles. So one axon has its connective tissue called the endoneurium, and multiple axons will have their own connective tissue called the perineurium. And then multiple fascicles will compose a nerve. And the nerve has an epineurium, so also connective tissue. And then it also has the blood vessels which supply it with nutrients. So that is a typical nerve in the peripheral nervous system. The neuronal connections. So the brain and spinal cord will send out nerves. So nerves exiting the cranium are called cranial nerves. So we have cranial nerves 1 to 12. So I would expect you to memorize those nerves, no? Olfactory, optic, oculomotor. So there are 12 cranial nerves. And then spinal nerves are those nerves exiting the spine. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal pair of spinal nerves. Most nerves convey a variety of visceral or somatic, sensory or motor fibers. So the nerves have mixed function. So there are signals going down, motor signals going down. There are sensory signals going up. The nerves can send the signals to the visceral organs within the body, or it can send the signals to the skeletal muscles or to the skin. So the nerves have multiple roles. Okay, so again, these are our spinal nerves. Spinal nerves, cervical in blue, thoracic in red, lumbar in green, and sacral and coccygeal. And then we have the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves can be motor or sensory in function or mixed. So now we go to the autonomic nervous system. This system is a subdivision of the motor nervous system that controls functions of the body not under conscious control. So unlike the skeletal nervous system, where you can think of flexing your elbow and you can move your elbow, for the autonomic nervous system, it controls our visceral organs. So you don't need to think about telling your stomach to digest the food, move the food downward, have the gland secrete digestive enzymes. So it is not under voluntary or conscious control. And unlike the skeletal nervous system where you have one neuron, for the autonomic nervous system you have two neurons, which I showed earlier. So there is the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. They connect the central nervous system with an end organ, usually consisting of smooth muscle, gland, or cardiac muscle. And we have two divisions, a sympathetic division and a parasympathetic division. Okay, so this is the autonomic nervous system. So again, it can come from the brain or the spinal cord. Here we have cranial nerves going out of the brain, sending signals to a ganglion here in the wall of the heart. And then the postsynaptic neuron will receive the signal and send it down to the cardiac muscle. No? And the parasympathetic nervous system can cause decrease in contractility, decrease in heart rate. No? So that is the effect of the parasympathetic. And again, it's a two-neuron pathway. There is a pre-sympathetic neuron with the cell body in the brain. And then there is a postsynaptic neuron with the cell body in the ganglion here. So that is the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. There is also a sympathetic division, and the neuron, the presynaptic neuron, is found in the spinal cord. It will send its signal down into the spinal nerve and into a sympathetic ganglion here, where it will synapse with its postsynaptic neuron. The postsynaptic neuron will send the signal down to the peripheral nerve going to the heart and send the signal to the cardiac muscle. Now the sympathetic will cause an increase in heart rate and an increase in contractility of the heart, increase the blood pressure. Okay? So again, it's a two-neuron pathway, but the difference here is that the ganglion is further away from the heart. So the postsynaptic neuron has a longer axon compared to the postsynaptic neuron of the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? So again, the skeletal motor system is illustrated here just to contrast. So it's just a single neuron here with the cell body here, and it sends its signal out to the spinal nerve to the muscle, to contract the muscle. Okay? So it's just a single neuron, while the autonomic nervous system, which innervates our visceral organs, is a two-neuron pathway. So for the sympathetic division, the presynaptic cell bodies are found in the intermediolateral cell column of gray matter in the thoracolumbar spinal cord. So the sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumbar division because the neurons are found in the thoracolumbar segments of the spinal cord. The presynaptic sympathetic fibers terminate in sympathetic ganglia. So again, ganglia because they are found in the peripheral nervous system. And the ganglia are formed of the cell bodies of the postsynaptic sympathetic neurons. Sympathetic ganglia are in the sympathetic trunks or around the roots of major branches of the abdominal aorta. So the sympathetic trunks are just beside the vertebral column. So another name for them is paravertebral ganglia. And those ganglia that are found near the aorta are called prevertebral ganglia. So this is the spinal cord, and we take a thoracic segment and enlarge it. Okay, this is gray matter containing cell bodies, and this is the intermediolateral horn. So the intermediolateral horn has the cell bodies of the presynaptic sympathetic neurons. Okay, so those in the first thoracic, second, and third thoracic will send its axons to the eye, the salivary glands. T4 to T6 will send signals to the heart, the lungs, and the esophagus, and so on down the line. So the presynaptic neurons will send signals to the ganglia, and then the postsynaptic neurons will send the signals to the end organs to have the effects of the sympathetic. So different effects for the eye, you have pupillary dilatation. For the heart, you have increased heart rate, increased contractility, For the lungs, you have dilation of the bronchi, to help the individual have increased muscular activity for a fight or flight response. That's the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, have presynaptic cell bodies in the gray matter of the brainstem. The brainstem is part of the brain, and the sacral segments of the spinal cord. So another name for the parasympathetic is the craniosacral outflow, because it comes out of the brainstem and the sacral spinal cord. Cell bodies of postsynaptic parasympathetic neurons of the trunk are located in or near the structure being innervated. So, like I showed you, it's located in the wall of the heart or in the wall of the organs that are being supplied. In contrast, those in the head are organized into discrete ganglia. Okay, so one very important part of the parasympathetic nervous system is the vagus nerve. You can see the vagus nerve here. It sends its signal down to the different ganglia in the walls of the organs. So the ganglia in the heart, in the lungs, in the GI tract, in the genitourinary tract. So a lot of visceral organs are supplied by the vagus nerve, the cranial nerve end. Okay, so these are the presympathetic, presynaptic fibers going into the ganglion, and then the postsynaptic fibers go into the end organs. Okay, so aside from cranial nerve 10, we have other cranial nerves like cranial nerve 3, 7, and 9. So cranial nerve 3 will send its signals to the eye. So 7 will send its signals to the different glands in the face, etc. So autonomic effects. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions usually have opposite but coordinated effects. The sympathetic system primarily regulates blood vessels and facilitates emergency responses, fight or flight response. So if an animal is frightened, the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the blood vessels will dilate, the heart will have increased contractility and increased heart rate, the muscles will have more blood supply in order to allow the animal to fight or flee from that stressful or frightening situation. Okay? So that's the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic system is primarily concerned with body conservation, often reversing the effects of sympathetic stimulation. So the parasympathetic will come into play when the animal is already away from the stressful situation. So the heart rate goes down, the GI tract will now move, so that the animal can recover from that stress. So the enteric nervous system is named because of its unique structure and ability to function autonomously, and it is increasingly considered as a separate component of the visceral nervous system. Most nerves distributing autonomic nerve fibers to body cavities also convey visceral sensory nerve fibers from the viscera that conduct impulses for pain or reflexes. So, a part of the autonomic nervous system going into the GI tract is called the enteric nervous system. So again, it is not under conscious control. It will work even without us thinking about digesting food. Okay, so that's the enteric nervous system. So that ends our first topic. No? So it's just a little introduction, but I hope you will read our textbook more. So this first topic was from Clinically Oriented Anatomy by Moore. So test questions will be from the book. So please read our book. Now we go to our second topic, vertebrae. So we will describe the anatomy of vertebrae. So a typical vertebra consists of vertebral bodies, vertebral arches, and processes extending from the vertebral arch. So the vertebral bodies function to bear weight and increase in size proportionately. So we can feel our vertebrae if we palpate our neck. At the back we have a prominent spinous process there. That's the spinous process of the 7 cervical vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae have small vertebral bodies. As you go down to the thoracic, down to the lumbar, the vertebral bodies gradually increase in weight because the bodies have to support the weight of the cervical, just the head, but the thoracic, the lumbar, the whole torso needs to be supported. So the vertebral bodies gradually increase in size. And then behind the bodies, we have vertebral arches, which collectively house and protect the spinal cord and the roots of spinal nerves. And then we have processes extending from the arch, which provide attachment and leverage for muscles or direct movements between vertebrae. So this is a typical lumbar vertebra. This is actually the second lumbar vertebra. So you are looking at the patient's vertebra from the top. So the patient is facing here. The patient is looking down. You are looking from the patient's head, above the patient's head, and you're seeing the vertebral body of L2 here. This is the vertebral body of L2. And then you have the arch. So the arch will protect the spinal cord here. And then from the arch, you have different processes. There's a process here going posteriorly, and then there's a process going laterally. And then we have articular processes which will articulate with the vertebra above. And we also have articular processes which will articulate with the vertebra below. So that's a lumbar, typical lumbar vertebra. This is the side view. So you can see the vertebral body here. And then there's the spinous process, posterior spinous process. And then an articular process here that articulates with the process of the vertebra below it. So inferior articular process articulating with the superior articular process of the next vertebra. Then we have an intervertebral disc here, in between bodies. Okay, so this is the side view. The patient is facing to your right side. You are looking at the lumbar vertebra from the side. Okay, and then we have spaces in between vertebrae. That's for the exit of the spinal roots. So the spinal nerves go out there. regional characteristics of vertebrae. Cervical vertebrae have a foramen in their transverse process called the foramina transversalis. So that is what is unique about cervical vertebrae. Thoracic vertebrae, what is unique about them is that they have costal facets. So costa, rib. So there are facets for the attachment of ribs. So the thoracic vertebrae have the facets for the ribs or costal facets. So that is what is unique about thoracic. For the lumbar vertebrae, there is no costal facet and there is no foramina transversalis, and you have larger vertebral bodies. For the sacral vertebrae, you can see that the vertebrae are fused together. 5 vertebrae that are fused, while the coccygeal vertebrae are rudimentary in nature in humans. Okay, so this is a typical cervical vertebra seen obliquely. You are looking at the superior body of the cervical vertebra. Then you can see here the vertebral arch. Then we have the processes, the spinous process, transverse process. And what is unique is there is a foramen in the transverse process, which is not found in this one, for example, in the thoracic. The transverse process does not have a foramen. So this foramen is for the vertebral artery. Vertebral artery goes up in the neck through the foramen transversalis. Okay, so that is what makes the cervical foramen. For the thoracic, again, what is unique about them is that they have the costal facets for the ribs. Those are costal facets because in the thoracic area you have our ribs going anteriorly. Okay. For the lumbar, so the transverse process does not have a foramen and there are no costal facets on the body. Okay. And the body is large to support the weight of the torso. Okay. So remember those unique characteristics of the different vertebrae. Joints of the vertebral column. So vertebrae are joined to form a semi-rigid column by intervertebral discs and zygapophyseal joints. So in between the bodies, we have the cartilaginous intervertebral discs, and we have the zygapophyseal joints made by the inferior and the superior articular processes. The relative thickness of the discs determines the degree of mobility, and the disposition of the zygapophyseal joints controls the type of movement between adjacent vertebrae. So depending on the orientation of the joints, we can have relatively mobile vertebrae, like in our cervical. We can nod forward and backward and turn side to side. The thoracic is limited because of the ribs and the orientation of the zygapophyseal joints. So there is not much rotation for the thoracic, just flexion extension. So this is the intervertebral disc, and then the joints in between vertebrae. So depending on the thickness, you can also have a curvature in the spine. So there are also also ligaments connecting the vertebrae. We have an anterior longitudinal ligament that is just in front of the bodies, and it will prevent hyperextension, prevent too much extension of the neck. So that ligament will prevent that. There are also other ligaments in the back, and all the other ligaments will resist forms of flexion. So too much nodding down will be resisted by all the other ligaments. The atlanto-occipital joints enable the nodding movement of the head. So the first cervical vertebra is connected to the cranium, and the joint will allow nodding movements, while the atlanto-axial joints, atlas and axis, atlas is C1, axis is C2. So there is a joint there that will enable rotational movement of the head. So turning the head from side to side. And then alar ligaments will limit the rotation. So this is C1, the first cervical vertebra, and C2. So you can see that it's unique because C1 does not have a body, and C2 has a very large process called the dens. So the dens of C2 looks like a tooth, so that's why it's called the dens. And it acts like the body of C1, but it is separated from C1 to allow the head to turn from left to right. So that's the atlanto-axial joint. And then the joint here between C1 and the cranium will allow the head to nod from front to back. Okay, so this is a statue depicting Atlas. So this is where C1 gets its name. So Atlas in Greek legend was someone who was forced to support the weight of the world. So C1 is called the Atlas because it supports the weight of the head. That's why it's called Atlas. Movements of the vertebral column. The cervical and lumbar regions are the most mobile of the vertebral column, most mobile areas, and consequently the most vulnerable to injury. Flexion and extension occur primarily in the cervical and lumbar regions, while rotation occurs in the cervical and thoracic regions. So this is the curvatures found in different ages. So when we are in the uterus, we just have this curvature of our spine. So it's just kyphosis. And in the newborn, because of postural changes, we develop this lordosis in the lumbar. And then as we grow older and are able to stand up against gravity, we also have the cervical lordosis. Okay, so the primary curvatures, the thoracic and sacral curvatures exist in the fetus, while the other curvatures are developmental, the cervical and the lumbar, as we go upright against gravity. So again, primary curvatures, the thoracic and sacral kyphosis are developmental, while the secondary curvatures are acquired in relation to the erect human posture. The curvatures provide shock-absorbing resilience and flexibility to the axial skeleton. No? So the curvatures allow us to walk and run and jump, no? And the spine is able to absorb the forces. Extensors of the back and abdominal flexors provide dynamic support to maintain the curvatures. Vasculature of the vertebral column. Spinal branches of major cervical and segmental arteries supply the vertebral column, while internal and external vertebral venous plexuses collect blood from vertebrae and drain in turn into vertebral veins of the neck and segmental veins of the throat. So this is just from the book. No? So we have arteries that supply the vertebrae and the spinal canal. Nerves of the vertebral column. The zygapophyseal joints are innervated by medial branches of adjacent posterior rami, while recurrent meningeal branches of spinal nerves supply most bone, intervertebral discs, ligaments, as well as meninges of the spinal cord. So injuries resulting in fractures of the bone or injuries to the discs or the ligaments will send pain signals to the brain. So these two groups of nerves convey all localized pain from the vertebral column. Okay, so this is the recurrent meningeal nerve. So it will supply the periosteum, the bone, the meninges covering the spinal cord, so that if there is any injury, it will send pain signals to the spinal cord and to the brain. Okay, that ends our second topic. So lastly, our final topic for today will be the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is the one protected by the vertebral arches, and contents of the vertebral canal are the spinal cord, the spinal nerve roots as they exit from the cord, CSF, and meninges or the coverings of the spinal cord. Okay, so again, this is the vertebral canal. This is the vertebral arch. So the bodies were taken out. So we can see the spinal cord here. So we see the gray matter, the white matter of the spinal cord, and then we see the coverings of the meninges of the spinal cord. And in between the spinal cord and the meninges, we have CSF, and we have the origins of the spinal nerves, of the nerve roots. So these are the contents of our vertebral canal. In adults, the spinal cord occupies only the superior 2/3 of the vertebral canal. So the spinal cord in adults will end at usually at L1, the first lumbar vertebra. So it only occupies the upper 2/3 of the vertebral canal. The spinal cord has two enlargements related to innervation of the limbs. So we have a lot of nerves going to the upper extremity and to the lower extremity, and the cell bodies of those nerves are in the cervical and in the lumbosacral segments. So we have cervical and lumbosacral enlargements. The conus medullaris ends at the level of L1 or L2 vertebra. However, the filum terminale and spinal nerve roots from the the lumbosacral part of the spinal cord form the cauda equina, and they continue inferiorly within the lumbar system. So this is a side view of the spinal cord again. So the spinal cord is in the vertebral canal, but it will end at about L1. And then the vertebral canal here is occupied by the nerve roots going down before they exit. So this is another view with the vertebral arches removed. So we can see the spinal cord, and it ends here at L1, and then the nerve roots continue on down before they exit to their foramina. So the nerve roots that go downward resemble the tail of the horse. So that's why it's called the cauda equina. Cauda, tail, equina, horse. So the tail of the horse, cauda equina. So if you need to sample CSF, you can puncture at L3 or L4 level, and you are sure not to injure the spinal cord, because the spinal cord ends at L1. So nerve tissues and neurovascular structures of the vertebral canal are suspended in CSF contained within the dural sac and dural root sheaths. The fluid fields of arachnoid space is lined with pia and arachnoid matter, which are continuous membranes. The lumbar cistern is an ideal site for sampling of CSF or for injection of anesthetic agents. So if you palpate the top of your hips and draw a line there, you will also be able to palpate L4. So L4 at the top of the hips. So you can insert your needle at L3, and you are sure that you won't injure the spinal cord, and you can get CSF. Okay, so again, this is a cross section of the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord, looking at the patient from the top. This is gray matter, this is white matter, and we have nerve roots, anterior nerve roots and posterior nerve roots going out, and then we have CSF inserting the spinal cord. So vasculature of the spinal cord and nerve roots. The spinal cord is supplied by longitudinal spinal arteries. These are the anterior spinal artery in front and two posterior spinal arteries in the back. They are reinforced by asymmetric segmental medullary arteries occurring at irregular intervals, mostly in association with cervical and lumbar enlargements that also supply the spinal nerve roots at those levels. At levels and on the sides where segmental medullary arteries do not occur, radicular arteries supply the nerve roots. So this is a view of the anterior part of the spinal cord. So the patient is facing you. We can see the anterior spinal artery here in the midline of the spinal cord, and it is supported by these arteries from the side. So segmental medullary arteries supply the anterior spinal artery to supply the cord with oxygen and nutrients. On this side, we have the posterior part of the cord, and we can see here the posterior spinal arteries. So arteries supplying the posterior spinal cord, and they are also reinforced by these segmental arteries coming from the periphery. The veins draining the cord have a distribution and drainage generally reflective of the spinal arteries, although there are normally 3 longitudinal spinal veins, both anteriorly and posteriorly. Okay, so the veins appear like this. So there are usually 3 veins in the front and in the back. So that ends our 3 topics for today. Thank you. So we have 3 hours pa. So I would like you to read more on the topics that we covered. You have your books more. So again, questions from the quiz will be from the book and some from the lectures. So please read our books. Okay, so our next meeting I think is May 8 because it's a holiday on May 1. Can we start 8:30 on May 8? 8:30 lang. And then I'll bring a laptop na lang. So thank you for this laptop today. Sige. So I'll see you on May 8. And please study your books, study more.